Montana Territory, 1875. The sky had bruised to a deep purple as the last gasp of daylight retreated behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Olivia Abernathy stared out across the windswept plains, the tall grass bending like waves under the evening breeze. At 26, the life he'd built felt as insubstantial as the clouds overhead. Here for a moment, then gone with the wind. "A man ain't meant to put down roots out here," he muttered to his horse, Samson, as they crested the hill overlooking the small frontier town of Clearwater. "The West takes more than it gives." His father's words, spoken before a Comanche arrow found his heart 5 years prior. Olivia had carried that belief like a talisman ever since, moving from town to town, ranch to ranch, never staying long enough for the ground beneath his boots to feel like anything but borrowed land. The scars across his back, remnants of a cattle rustling gone wrong in his younger days, were nothing compared to the ones he carried inside. Love was a luxury for settled folk back east, not for men who lived by their wits and six-shooters in a land that could kill you 100 different ways before sundown. What Olivia wanted was simple enough money to buy a small piece of land in Oregon, far from the violence and unpredictability of frontier life. What he needed, though he'd sooner face down a grizzly than admit it, was to fill the hollow space that echoed in his chest each night as he stared at the stars, the only consistent companions in his nomadic existence. As Samson picked his way down the slope toward town, Olivia adjusted his worn Stetson and straightened his back. Clearwater was just another stop, another few weeks of work at the Silverman Ranch before moving on. Nothing more. The first gunshot splintered the evening quiet just as Olivia reached the edge of town. The second sent him spurring Samson forward at a gallop. A woman's scream cut through the air as he rounded the corner onto the main street. Outside the Clearwater Mercantile, 3 men surrounded a young woman who stood protectively in front of a fallen older man. One of the assailants held a smoking pistol, while another yanked at the woman's arm. "You'll pay what you owe one way or another, Sawyer," the armed man shouted. Without thinking, Olivia drew his Colt and fired once into the air. "That'll be enough of that," he called, his voice carrying the hard edge that had kept him alive this long. 3 heads whipped toward him, but it was the woman who caught his attention. Even in the fading light, he could see her emerald eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and defiance. Her chestnut hair had come partially loose from its pins, framing a face that might have belonged on one of those fancy paintings in Eastern parlors. She couldn't have been more than 22, dressed in a simple blue calico dress now smudged with dust. "This ain't your business, stranger," snarled the man with the gun. "Making it my business," Olivia replied, keeping his voice steady as he dismounted. 3 against 1 woman don't seem sporting to my mind. The standoff lasted only moments before the town marshal and several armed townsmen came running at the commotion. The 3 assailants backed away, the leader pointing a finger at the woman. "This ain't over, Miss Sawyer. Your pa's debts don't die with him." As they slunk away, Olivia holstered his weapon and approached the woman, who was now kneeling beside the older man. "Papa, can you hear me?" Her voice trembled with worry. "He needs a doctor," Olivia said, crouching beside them. "Is there one in town?" She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Dr. Hollister, 2 blocks down." Then, with a composure that surprised him, she looked directly at Olivia. "Please help me get him there. I cannot carry him alone." Something in her direct gaze stirred an unfamiliar sensation in Olivia's chest. He had planned to ride straight through to the Silverman Ranch, not get entangled in local troubles. But as he lifted the unconscious man, feeling the fragile weight of mortality in his arms, Olivia knew his plans had just changed. "I'm Olivia Abernathy," he said as they hurried toward the doctor's office. "Madeline Sawyer," she replied, her hand resting protectively on her father's chest as Olivia carried him. "And I'm afraid you've ridden right into our troubles, Mr. Abernathy." Little did Olivia know how those words would echo through the coming months, challenging everything he thought he knew about life on the frontier and about himself. 2 weeks later, Olivia paused in mending a broken fence post on the Sawyer property. From here, he could see Madeline hanging laundry, her movements efficient despite the burden she carried. Her father, Thomas Sawyer, was recovering slowly from the bullet that had grazed his shoulder, but the debts he'd accumulated during a year of failed crops and illness had brought vultures circling. Olivia had delayed his start at the Silverman Ranch, telling himself it was just for a few days to help the Sawyers get back on their feet. A few days had stretched into 2 weeks, and still he found reasons to stay. The small homestead needed more repairs than one woman could manage alone, especially with her father bedridden. "You're a fool, Abernathy," he muttered to himself as he drove the hammer down with more force than necessary. "Getting yourself caught up in someone else's fight." But it wasn't just any fight. Madeline had explained how her father had borrowed money from Silas Thornton, a wealthy cattle baron who'd been buying up struggling homesteads throughout the valley. When Thomas couldn't repay his loan, Thornton had offered an alternative: Madeline's hand in marriage to his son, Gabriel. Her refusal had triggered Thornton's wrath, culminating in the confrontation Olivia had interrupted. The law might officially exist in Montana Territory, but Olivia knew how little that meant when powerful men like Thornton decided to make their own rules. He'd seen it play out a dozen times in frontier towns across the West. "Mr. Abernathy?" Madeline's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She approached with a canteen of water, her face flushed from working in the afternoon sun. "You've been at it since dawn. You should rest." He accepted the water with a nod of thanks. "Fence won't fix itself, Miss Sawyer." "Madeline, please." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "After all you've done for us, formality seems rather pointless, doesn't it?" Olivia found himself noticing how the sunlight caught the rich chestnut of her hair, bringing out auburn highlights he hadn't seen before. He looked away quickly, taking a long drink. "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know us. You had work waiting at the Silverman Ranch. Man sees folks in trouble, he helps out. That's all." The answer sounded hollow even to his own ears. Madeline studied him with those clear green eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. Most men would have ridden on after the marshal arrived. "You stayed. You're still here." Olivia returned to hammering, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Silverman's will still need hands when I get there." "I have nothing to give you in return," she said quietly. "We can barely feed ourselves right now." He paused, looking at her directly for the first time that day. Something about her vulnerability, coupled with the stubborn set of her jaw, pierced through his practiced detachment. "I'm not looking for payment." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared on the road leading to the homestead. Olivia recognized Thornton's men instantly. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Bar the door." "This is my home," Madeline replied, lifting her chin. "I won't hide." Before he could argue, the riders had reached the fence line. Gabriel Thornton led the group, his expensive Eastern clothes looking out of place against the rugged Montana landscape. He was barely older than Madeline, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the perpetual sneer. "Well now, what have we here?" Gabriel called. "Miss Sawyers found herself a new farmhand? Or is it something more personal?" Olivia set down his hammer deliberately and straightened to his full height. At 6 feet 2 inches, he stood several inches taller than any of the mounted men. "State your business and move on," he said. Gabriel laughed. "My business is with the lovely Miss Sawyer. My father sent me to remind her that the offer still stands. Marry me, and all debts are forgiven." His eyes raked over her in a way that made Olivia's hand twitch toward his holster. "Of course, the homestead would still become Thornton property, but you'd have a proper roof over your head. Better than this hovel." Madeline stepped forward. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Thornton. I would sooner lose everything than marry into your family." "Careful now," Gabriel's voice hardened. "Pride doesn't feed an old man through winter. Your father mightn't survive another season out here." Olivia moved slightly, positioning himself between Madeline and the riders. The lady's given her answer. "Best you ride on." "And who might you be to give orders on Sawyer land?" Gabriel demanded. "Someone who doesn't take kindly to threats against women." The tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Gabriel's hand hovered near his pistol, but something in Olivia's steady gaze made him reconsider. "We'll be back in 1 week," Gabriel finally said. "My father's patience has limits, Miss Sawyer. Consider carefully what your pride might cost." He tipped his hat mockingly before turning his horse. As the riders disappeared down the road, Madeline released a shaky breath. "They'll be back. And next time, there might be more of them." "I know," Olivia said, watching the dust settle in their wake. That night, after a simple supper of cornbread and rabbit stew, Olivia sat on the porch steps cleaning his pistol. The Montana night had settled around the homestead, stars burning bright in the vast darkness. He could hear Madeline moving about inside, tending to her father before retiring. The door opened, spilling soft lamplight onto the porch. Madeline stepped out, now wearing a shawl against the evening chill. "May I join you?" she asked. Olivia nodded, setting his cleaning rag aside. She settled beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent she carried. "Papa's asleep," she said. "The medicine Dr. Hollister provided helps with the pain." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, the chorus of night insects providing gentle background music. "I was engaged once," Madeline said suddenly. 2 years ago, to a young man who worked for the railroad. He was killed in an accident before we could marry. She twisted a loose thread on her shawl. "After that, I promised myself I would never marry without love, even if it meant losing everything else." Olivia felt her words resonate within him. "My pa used to say the frontier's no place for sentimentality. Said a man out here needs to look out for himself first." "And do you believe that?" He stared out at the darkened landscape. "Believed it for a long time. Seen too many good folks broken by this country. Yet here you are," she observed, "helping strangers instead of looking out for yourself." The contradiction in his actions versus his professed beliefs hung in the air between them. Before he could respond, a wolf howled in the distance, its mournful call echoing across the valley. "Beautiful and dangerous," Madeline murmured. "Like so much of this territory." Their eyes met briefly in the darkness, and Olivia felt something shift in his carefully ordered world, like the first tremor before an avalanche. The following days fell into a rhythm. Olivia rose before dawn to tend to the livestock and repair what he could around the homestead. Madeline cooked and cared for her father, whose strength gradually returned. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes sharing comfortable silence. Olivia learned that Madeline had been educated back east before her mother's death had brought her to Montana with her father 5 years earlier. She spoke of books and ideas with a passion that both bewildered and fascinated him. In turn, he found himself sharing stories of his travels across the territories that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. On the 4th day after Thornton's men had visited, Thomas Sawyer emerged from the house for the first time, leaning heavily on a walking stick. "Mr. Abernathy," he called as Olivia mended a hole in the barn roof. "Might I have a word?" Olivia climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his trousers before approaching the older man. Up close, Thomas looked even more frail than Olivia had realized, his illness having taken a greater toll than the bullet wound. "Sir," Olivia acknowledged with a respectful nod. "My daughter tells me you've refused any payment for your help," Thomas said, his voice wavering slightly with the effort of standing. "A man deserves compensation for his labor." "No need," Olivia replied, "just lending a hand where it's needed." Thomas studied him with eyes that matched his daughter's in color, if not in youthful brightness. "Madeline also tells me you intercepted Thornton's men the other day. They weren't being particularly neighborly." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. "No, I don't imagine they were." He sighed, looking out across the homestead, 20 acres of hard-won land that represented his life's work. "Thornton will not stop, Mr. Abernathy. He wants this land for the water rights. The marriage proposal to my daughter is merely his idea of appearing generous." "Figured as much," Olivia acknowledged. "I've been a proud man. Too proud, perhaps." Thomas's gaze returned to Olivia, suddenly sharp with clarity. "But I will not allow my pride to endanger my daughter. When Thornton's men return, I intend to settle this matter." "Meaning?" "I will sign over the deed to the land. In exchange, our debts will be cleared, and Madeline will be free of any obligation to the Thornton family." Olivia frowned. "This land is everything to your daughter. Her safety means more," Thomas said firmly. "We can start again elsewhere." Before Olivia could respond, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. It wasn't Thornton's men this time, but Marshal Fletcher from town, accompanied by a man in a banker's suit. Madeline emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron as she came to stand beside her father. Olivia noticed how she subtly positioned herself to support the older man's weight. "Mr. Sawyer," the marshal called as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Mr. Whitley from the bank asked me to accompany him on official business." The banker descended awkwardly from the wagon, clutching a leather portfolio. "Mr. Sawyer, I regret to inform you that your note has been called in its entirety. The bank requires immediate payment of $165. Thomas paled visibly. That's impossible, Whitley. You agreed to quarterly payments. I'm afraid circumstances have changed, the banker replied, not meeting anyone's eyes. The full amount is due within 3 days, or foreclosure proceedings will begin. Olivia didn't need to ask whose influence had precipitated this sudden change. Thornton clearly owned more than just land in Clearwater. This is outrageous, Madeline exclaimed. The harvest is still 2 months away. How can anyone be expected to produce such a sum without warning? The banker had no answer, merely extending the official notice with a trembling hand. After they departed, Thomas sank heavily onto a nearby bench, the paper crumpled in his fist. So that's his game, he said bitterly. Force our hand before we can seek help elsewhere. Madeline knelt before her father, taking his hands in hers. We'll find a way, Papa. Perhaps we could sell some of the livestock. It wouldn't be enough, Thomas interrupted gently. Not nearly enough. Olivia stood silently, watching the despair settle over both Sawyers. An idea had been forming in his mind over the past few days, a reckless, possibly foolish idea. Now, faced with their imminent loss, he made his decision. I have the money, he said quietly. Both Sawyers looked up at him in shock. What did you say? Madeline asked. I have savings. Enough to cover the note. Thomas straightened, his pride visibly wrestling with desperation. We cannot accept such charity, Mr. Abernathy. You hardly know us. Not charity, Olivia replied. An investment. I've been looking for land of my own. Instead of buying elsewhere, I could buy in as a partner here. The words were coming faster now, the plan solidifying as he spoke. The homestead needs 2 able-bodied workers to reach its potential. You have the knowledge, Mr. Sawyer. I have the strength and some experience with cattle. He could see Thomas weighing the proposition, calculating the practicalities against his pride. A partnership, Thomas repeated slowly. Equal shares. Equal shares, Olivia confirmed. We keep the land out of Thornton's hands, and we all benefit from making it profitable. Madeline stood, her eyes searching Olivia's face. Why would you do this? You've spoken of Oregon, of land there. Olivia met her gaze steadily, aware that he was crossing a line he'd drawn for himself years ago. Sometimes plans change, Miss Sawyer. That evening, as Thomas retired early, exhausted by the day's events, Madeline followed Olivia to the barn where he was settling the horses for the night. You don't have to do this, she said without preamble. I know what you're risking by staying. Thornton is not a man who forgives perceived slights. Olivia continued brushing down Samson's coat. I'm not afraid of Thornton. Perhaps you should be, she countered. He's ruined men for less than what you're proposing. Olivia set down the brush and turned to face her. In the lantern light, her features were softened, making her look younger than her 22 years. Why are you so determined to refuse help, he asked. Her shoulders stiffened. I'm not refusing help. I'm refusing to see another person harmed because of us. Because of me. This isn't just about your father's debts, is it? Olivia asked, the pieces suddenly fitting together. Thornton's interest in you predates the money. A flush crept up her neck. Gabriel Thornton has been persistent in his attention since I arrived in Clearwater. I made it clear his interest wasn't reciprocated, but he's not accustomed to rejection. She wrapped her arms around herself. When Papa needed the loan, Silas Thornton saw an opportunity. Anger flared in Olivia's chest, hot and unfamiliar. That's not going to happen. You can't promise that, she said softly. I have nothing to give you in return for your kindness, Mr. Abernathy. Nothing but gratitude and debt. Olivia stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Your heart is everything, he said, the words emerging before he could examine them. Your courage, your determination to protect what you love. That's worth more than land or money. Surprise registered on her face, followed by something deeper that made his pulse quicken. For a heartbeat, he thought she might move closer, but instead, she took a step back. I should check on Papa, she whispered, her voice unsteady. As she hurried from the barn, Olivia leaned against Samson's stall, wondering what had possessed him to speak so openly. The walls he'd built around himself for years were crumbling, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to rebuild them. The confrontation came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, As Olivia and Thomas were discussing plans for expanding the cattle herd, 6 riders appeared on the horizon. At their head rode Silas Thornton himself, a large man whose expensive clothes couldn't disguise the ruthlessness in his bearing. "Get inside," Olivia told Thomas. "Keep Madeline there too." The older man hesitated. "This is my fight." "Our fight now," Olivia corrected him. "Partnership, remember? But you're still recovering. Let me handle this first meeting." Reluctantly, Thomas retreated to the house as the riders approached. Olivia positioned himself in front of the porch steps, his stance relaxed but alert, his right hand resting casually near his holster. Thornton reined in his horse a few yards away, assessing the homestead and Olivia with calculating eyes. "You must be the drifter who's taken up with the Sawyers," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education overlaid with frontier harshness. "Olivia Abernathy," he replied evenly, "co-owner of this homestead." A ripple of surprise passed through Thornton's men. Clearly, this development hadn't reached their ears yet. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly. "Co-owner? An interesting claim, given that Thomas Sawyer's property is scheduled for bank auction in 3 days. The note's been satisfied," Olivia informed him. "Paid in full yesterday afternoon." Anger flashed across Thornton's face before he controlled his expression. "I see. And where would a saddle tramp and a failing farmer find $165 on such short notice?" "That's between us and the bank." Behind him, Olivia heard the cabin door open. Despite his instructions, both Thomas and Madeline had emerged onto the porch. Madeline stood tall, her green eyes blazing with defiance as she met Thornton's gaze. "Mr. Thornton," she acknowledged coldly, "I believe our business is concluded." Thornton's attention shifted entirely to her, his expression softening in a way that made Olivia's skin crawl. "My dear Miss Sawyer, our business has only begun. A woman of your qualities deserves better than this hardscrabble existence." "I'm quite satisfied with my life here," she replied. Gabriel Thornton urged his horse forward, coming to stand beside his father. "A pity," he drawled. "We could have made this easy. Now it will have to be difficult." Olivia stepped forward, drawing all attention back to himself. "I think you gentlemen have overstayed your welcome. This is private property." "For now," Silas Thornton replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "But the West has ways of sorting out who belongs and who doesn't. Accidents happen. Cattle disappear. Fires start." His eyes swept over the homestead. Sometimes entire families vanish without a trace. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable in its clarity. "That sounded remarkably like a threat, Mr. Thornton," came a new voice. Marshal Fletcher rode up the path, accompanied by 3 armed townsmen. Threatening honest homesteaders is frowned upon in Clearwater. Thornton's expression remained impassive, though Olivia noted the tightening of his jaw. "Simply making conversation, Marshal, highlighting the dangers of frontier life." "Indeed," Fletcher replied dryly. "Well, as long as you're here for conversation, you can deliver a message back to town. The territorial governor will be visiting next month, and I've invited him to investigate recent land acquisitions in our county. Seems some complaints have been filed about coercive practices." A tense silence fell over the gathering. Thornton clearly hadn't expected this development. "Political winds change, Marshal," Thornton finally said. "Best remember who provides the lifeblood of this community." "I remember my oath to uphold the law for all citizens," Fletcher replied evenly. "Wealthy and humble alike." With a tight nod, Thornton wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he said, looking directly at Madeline before spurring his mount down the road, his men following close behind. After the marshal and his men departed with promises to keep an eye on the homestead, Madeline approached Olivia, who stood watching the horizon where Thornton had disappeared. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "You've made an enemy today." Olivia turned to her, struck again by her beauty and strength. "He was already an enemy to what matters to me." Her eyes widened slightly at his words. "And what matters to you, Mr. Abernathy?" Before he could answer, Thomas joined them, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "The marshal mentioned something interesting before he left," he said. "Apparently, Thornton's been buying land using questionable methods throughout the territory. The governor's visit could change everything." "If we can hold out that long," Madeline cautioned. "We will," Olivia assured them both, surprising himself with his certainty. For the first time in years, he felt rooted to a place, to people who needed him, and whom, he was beginning to realize, he needed just as much. The following weeks brought changes to the Sawyer homestead. With Olivia's savings, they purchased additional cattle and supplies to repair the neglected buildings. Thomas's health improved enough that he could supervise the work, sharing his knowledge of the land with Olivia, who absorbed everything with the dedication of a man building something meant to last. Madeline watched this transformation with growing wonder. The nomadic cowboy who had ridden into their lives was becoming something else entirely, a man with purpose, with connection, with roots. More unsettling was her own transformation, the way her heart quickened when he entered a room, the lingering glances they exchanged over supper, the conversations that stretched late into the night. True to his word, Thornton didn't give up easily. First came offers from various merchants to buy the homestead at prices well above market value. When those were rejected, accidents began to happen. A section of repaired fence was cut one night, allowing several cattle to wander. The water pump was damaged. Shots were fired near the property line after dark. Through it all, Olivia remained steadfast. He organized a watch schedule with neighboring homesteaders who had also resisted Thornton's expansion. The marshal increased patrols along the road. Slowly, a community of resistance formed around them. One evening, as summer began to give way to early autumn, Olivia found Madeline at the edge of the creek that ran through the property. Twilight painted the landscape in soft purples and golds as she stood watching the water flow past, seemingly lost in thought. "Everything all right?" he asked, approaching quietly. She turned, offering a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just thinking." "Dangerous pastime," he teased gently. A genuine laugh escaped her. "So my father always says." Her expression sobered. "I was thinking about what happens after the governor's visit. If Thornton's power is broken." "When?" Olivia corrected. "When his power is broken." She nodded. "When that happens, will you stay?" The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Olivia moved to stand beside her, their shoulders nearly touching as they both faced the creek. "I signed a partnership agreement," he reminded her. "Agreements can be dissolved," she said softly. "You spoke of Oregon, of land there." He turned to face her directly. "That was before." "Before what?" "Before I found something worth staying for." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way Olivia had never allowed himself to be. For years, he had lived by his father's creed. The frontier was no place for attachments, for putting down roots that could be violently torn away. Yet here he stood, having invested not just his money but his heart in this place, in these people, in her. Madeline's eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of uncertainty. "I told you before that I have nothing to give you in return for what you've done for us." "And I told you," he said, reaching out slowly to take her hand. "Your heart is everything." Their fingers intertwined, a simple touch that seemed to ignite something between them. Olivia felt a lifetime of walls crumbling as Madeline stepped closer, her free hand coming to rest against his chest. "Is that what you want?" she whispered. "My heart. Only if freely given," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. Her response was to rise on her tiptoes, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that spoke of all the unspoken feelings that had grown between them. Olivia's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Madeline rested her forehead against his chest. "I never expected to find you," she murmured. "Nor I you," he admitted. "I've spent years running from anything that might tie me down." She looked up at him, her expression suddenly serious. "And now I can't imagine being anywhere but here, with you." The moment of perfect understanding between them was shattered by the sound of a gunshot in the distance, followed by a man's shout. They broke apart, instantly alert. "That came from the house," Olivia said, already running, Madeline close behind. They crested the small rise to see flames licking up the side of the barn. Thomas stood in the yard, his shotgun raised toward three mounted figures retreating into the darkness. "Papa!" Madeline cried, rushing to her father. "I'm unharmed," Thomas assured her, though his face was ashen with rage. They set the barn ablaze. I fired a warning shot. Olivia was already organizing their response, shouting for the bucket line as neighbors, alerted by the commotion, began arriving to help. For 2 hours, They fought the fire, finally containing it before it could spread to the house or other outbuildings. Half the barn was lost, along with some of the winter feed, but miraculously, all the livestock had escaped unharmed. As dawn broke over the smoking remains, Olivia found Madeline sitting on the porch steps, her face and clothing smudged with soot, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "This is what loving me costs," she said as he sat beside her. "Destruction. Danger." "No," he said firmly. "This is what Thornton's greed costs. Not your love." She looked at him, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "I'm afraid, Olivia. Not for myself, but for you. For Papa. For everything we're building here." He took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Fear is natural, but we can't let it rule us. That's what Thornton wants, for us to be so afraid we surrender what matters most." "And what matters most to you?" she asked, echoing her question from days earlier. This time, he didn't hesitate. "You. Your father. This land. The future we could build here together." He paused, gathering courage for words he'd never spoken before. "I love you, Madeline Sawyer. I think I've loved you since that first day in town, when you stood protecting your father despite the danger to yourself." Fresh tears spilled from her eyes, but her smile was radiant through them. "And I love you, Olivia Abernathy, despite my best efforts not to." He laughed softly. "Stubborn woman. You have no idea," she replied, leaning against his shoulder as the sun continued its ascent, bringing light to the damage of the night, and to the possibility of rebuilding something stronger. The attack on the barn marked a turning point. Word spread quickly throughout the valley, and by midday, more than 20 neighboring homesteaders had gathered at the Sawyer property. These were hard-working men and women who had watched Thornton's expansion with growing unease, afraid to stand alone, but finding courage in numbers. Marshal Fletcher arrived with news. The territorial governor had advanced his visit and would arrive within the week, prompted by reports of escalating violence. Until then, the marshal organized a rotating guard of volunteers to protect the most vulnerable homesteads, including the Sawyers. That night, as Olivia took his turn on watch, Thomas joined him on the newly rebuilt porch. "I owe you an apology, son," the older man said without preamble. Olivia looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For doubting your intentions toward my daughter." Thomas settled into the rocking chair, wincing slightly at the movement. "I've seen how you look at her, and how she looks at you." Heat crept up Olivia's neck. "Sir, Thomas raised a hand to stop him. "No need for explanations. Love isn't something that requires justification." He gazed out at the starlit property. "My Evelyn, Madeline's mother, and I had only known each other 3 weeks when I asked her to marry me. Everyone said we were rushing, that it wouldn't last." A sad smile touched his lips. "We had 20 wonderful years before typhoid took her." "I'm sorry," Olivia said quietly. "Don't be. We had more happiness in those years than most find in a lifetime." Thomas fixed Olivia with a penetrating gaze. "Which brings me to my point. When you find the right person, you know it. And when you know it, you shouldn't waste time questioning it. Not out here, where tomorrow is never guaranteed." Olivia absorbed the older man's words, recognizing the wisdom in them. "I love her," he said simply. "I want to build a life with her. Here, if she'll have me." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's what I needed to hear." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the moonlight, a gold ring with a modest diamond. This was Evelyn's. Madeline should have it now. Olivia accepted the ring with reverent hands. "Are you sure?" "Never been more certain of anything," Thomas assured him. "Just don't waste any time. This territory has taught me that life is precious and fleeting." The following morning, Madeline found Olivia repairing the corral fence, his sleeves rolled up despite the autumn chill, revealing the strong forearms that had become so familiar to her. "More visitors," she announced, handing him a cup of coffee. "The Millers from the North Valley. They've brought lumber to help rebuild the barn." Olivia accepted the coffee gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "People are finally standing together against Thornton. It's remarkable," she agreed, her eyes reflecting the wonder she felt at the community's response. Mrs. Miller mentioned that 3 more families have filed formal complaints with the territorial office. There's talk that Thornton might face criminal charges for some of his methods. "That would change everything. For everyone," she said. "Not just us." They shared a moment of comfortable silence, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. Olivia felt the weight of Thomas's ring in his pocket, wondering if this was the right moment. Before he could decide, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. Gabriel Thornton rode into view, alone this time, his expression thunderous as he dismounted. "Isn't this touching?" he sneered, glancing between them. The drifter and the spinster playing at domesticity. Olivia stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Madeline. "State your business and leave, Thornton." Gabriel's hand rested on his pistol. "My business is with Miss Sawyer. My father sent me with a final offer before things get irreversible." "Your father's threats don't frighten us anymore," Madeline said, moving to stand beside Olivia rather than behind him. "The governor arrives in 4 days. I suggest you focus on preparing your defense rather than making more enemies." Anger contorted Gabriel's features. "You stupid woman. Do you think a governor's visit will change anything? My father owns half the territory officials. This little rebellion you've inspired will be crushed, and you'll watch everyone you care about suffer before the end." In a flash, Gabriel drew his pistol, aiming it directly at Madeline. "Perhaps a demonstration is in order." Olivia reacted instinctively, shoving Madeline aside as the shot rang out. Searing pain exploded in his left shoulder as the bullet found flesh instead of its intended target. He staggered but remained standing, his right hand already drawing his own weapon. "Drop it," came Thomas's voice from the porch, where he stood with his shotgun leveled at Gabriel. Gabriel hesitated, clearly calculating his odds against 2 armed men, even with 1 wounded. Around them, workers from the barn reconstruction appeared, alerted by the gunshot, several carrying tools that could easily become weapons. Slowly, Gabriel lowered his pistol. "This changes nothing," he spat. Your father is being arrested as we speak," interrupted a new voice. Marshal Fletcher rode into the yard, accompanied by 2 deputies and a distinguished-looking man in a fine suit. "Gabriel Thornton, you're under arrest for attempted murder." As the deputies took Gabriel into custody, the well-dressed stranger approached, removing his hat respectfully. "Governor Howard," he introduced himself. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but after receiving Marshal Fletcher's urgent message, I decided to come immediately rather than wait for the scheduled visit." Thomas lowered his shotgun, stunned. "Governor, we're honored, despite the circumstances." Madeline had rushed to Olivia's side, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding shoulder. "He needs a doctor," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Dr. Hollister is on his way," the marshal assured her. He was attending to some other business at the Thornton estate. Governor Howard surveyed the scene with grave concern. "Marshal Fletcher has briefed me on the situation here. Rest assured, the territorial government will investigate these matters thoroughly. Land fraud, intimidation, attempted murder. These are serious charges that will be addressed with the full weight of the law." As they spoke, Dr. Hollister arrived, immediately directing Olivia to be taken inside where he could properly treat the wound. "It's a clean shot through," the doctor pronounced after examination. "Missed anything vital?" "You're a lucky man, Mr. Abernathy." "I feel lucky," Olivia replied, his eyes finding Madeline's as she hovered anxiously nearby. Despite the pain, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The confrontation that had been building for weeks had finally reached its climax, and they had survived. Later that evening, after the governor and marshal had departed with promises of justice and protection, Olivia sat propped up in bed, his shoulder bandaged, an arm in a sling. Madeline entered with a tray of food, setting it beside him before perching on the edge of the bed. "Papa's speaking with the neighbors," she said. "Planning the barn rebuilding now that we know we'll be able to stay." Olivia reached for her hand with his good arm. "We were always going to stay. Thornton was never going to win." She squeezed his fingers, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You could have died today." "But I didn't. This time," she whispered. "The West takes so much from those who try to tame it. My mother, your father, so many others." Olivia understood then the fear that had been haunting her, the same fear that had kept him moving for years, never allowing himself to form attachments that could be severed by the harsh realities of frontier life. "Madeline," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, vulnerability evident in their green depths. "The frontier takes, yes, but it also gives. It gave me you. It gave us this chance to build something together. With his good arm, he reached into his pocket and withdrew Thomas's ring. Your father gave me this last night. Said it was your mother's. Madeline's breath caught as she recognized the ring. Papa gave you this. With his blessing, Olivia confirmed. I had planned a more romantic moment, but today reminded me that we can't afford to wait for perfect moments. He held the ring between them, a small circle of gold that represented everything he had once feared and now embraced. I love you, Madeline Sawyer. Will you marry me? Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Olivia Abernathy. I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Olivia felt the last pieces of his old self, the drifter, the loner, the man afraid of connection, fall away completely. In their place stood a man ready to embrace not just the challenges of the frontier, but its greatest reward, a love strong enough to endure them. 2 months later, with the first snow dusting the Montana landscape, Olivia stood beside Madeline in the newly rebuilt Clearwater Church. Thomas Sawyer, still thin but standing straight with pride, had just placed his daughter's hand in Olivia's. The changes in the valley had been swift after the governor's intervention. Silas Thornton faced criminal charges, his empire crumbling as investigations revealed the extent of his corrupt practices. Gabriel had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for attempted murder. Land that had been fraudulently acquired was being returned to its rightful owners. More personally, the Sawyer homestead, now the Sawyer Abernathy Ranch, was thriving. The new barn stood stronger than before, filled with an expanded herd purchased with funds from Olivia's original investment. Thomas had taken to teaching Olivia everything he knew about the land, passing on knowledge that would ensure the ranch's prosperity for years to come. As they exchanged their vows before friends and neighbors who had stood with them through the darkest days, Olivia marveled at how completely his life had transformed in just a few months. The man who had arrived in Clearwater believing the frontier was no place for love now stood pledging his heart and future to the woman who had shown him otherwise. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride. As their lips met, sealing their commitment amid cheers from the gathered community, Olivia felt a certainty he had never known before. The frontier might be harsh and unpredictable, but with Madeline beside him, it was also home in the truest sense. Not just a place, but a belonging. At the celebration afterward, held in the community hall, Thomas raised a glass to the newlyweds. To my daughter and new son, he said, his voice strong despite his frailty. May you build a legacy on this land that lasts for generations to come. Later, as Olivia and Madeline danced slowly in the center of the hall, he held her close, mindful of his still healing shoulder. Happy? He asked softly. She looked up at him, love shining in her eyes. Completely. And you? I never knew I could be this happy, he admitted. I spent so many years running from connection, believing my father's warning that the frontier was no place for love. And now I know the truth, he said, pressing his forehead gently against hers. Love isn't a luxury out here, it's a necessity. It's what makes the hardship worthwhile. Madeline smiled, her arms tightening around his waist. Remember what you said to me that day by the barn? When I told you I had nothing to give you in return for your help. Your heart is everything. He quoted himself, smiling at the memory. You were right, she whispered. And now you have it. Forever. As winter settled over the Montana territory, the Sawyer Abernathy Ranch stood as a testament to what could be built when fear gave way to courage, isolation to connection, and survival to love. The harsh frontier that had once seemed to Olivia a place where a man should guard his heart at all costs had become the very place where his heart had found its home. In the land, in community, and most of all, in the woman who had taught him that even in the wildest West, love was the greatest strength of all.